It would be an understatement to say that people have been talking about Jaguar of late. And across the past couple of years, you and I have studied a variety of their models between the 1950s and 1990s. But it seems that today people are now pining for a set of Jaguar brand ideals that 25 years ago were met with skepticism and market failure, but have now matured enough to realise that, realistically, they made some damn fine cars. So today on TwinCam, resplendent with its supercharged V8, this is the Jaguar S-Type R. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics. So if you could see yourself piloting the undisputed bargain of the retro super saloons, then please do follow the link in the description. But today I'm going to try and keep things at least somewhat reined in. So rather than this being a retrospective on the S-Type as a whole, this video is instead going to centre around this S-Type R. Jaguar's M5 and AMG basher of the new millennium, but that does not mean that we cannot also have a bit of a history lesson. For a whole 30 years, between the end of the 1960s and the late 1990s, Jaguar only really built a single saloon car. As their big executive, the XJ defined what it meant to be a Jaguar, selling in peaks and troughs, weathering the storms of the 70s and 80s. Under the control of British Leyland between 1968 and 1984, a replacement for the original Series XJ was not forthcoming, developed as it was amid a backdrop of industrial turmoil, ever worsening quality and eventual nationalisation. Put simply, money was desperately tight, and by the time it was launched in 1986, the new XJ40 carried on the stylistic traditions of the original, rooted firmly in 1968. At the end of the 80s, Jaguar's brief independence was ended as Ford hunted for an upmarket subsidiary. In the early 90s, therefore, the Blue Oval saw Jaguar as a renovation project. They had to repair the perception Browns Lane had gained for flaky quality, prioritising this over any radical modernisation. American money would be spent on new facilities and upgraded working practices rather than new cars, which, if we're honest, weren't totally necessary. After all, the platform beneath the XJ40 and XJS coupe and convertible stood up phenomenally well. In fact, the platform Jaguar had created back in the early 60s was deemed capable enough to support Ford's revival of another British marque, underpinning the Aston Martin DB7 in 1994. Indeed, steadily sorting through Jaguar's image for quality, or lack thereof, helped the XJS climb to the peak of its sales, no matter the fact that it was 20 years old. But as for the saloons, the XJ40 would be heavily facelifted to become the X300 and finally the X308 Jaguar XJ. This basic car running from 1986 to 2003. If you're interested in this era of Jaguar, then I'd highly recommend watching my video on this car, a card for which will be up in the corner. But even with the XJS's replacement in 1996, building only two distinct models was viewed as a hindrance to Jaguar's future growth. In that period of Jaguar's relative slump, the executive market had been fundamentally changed, BMW rising to prominence with a deeply coherent range of 3, 5 and 7 series, the latter of which challenged the XJ, but the former two of which provided the Bavarians with a burgeoning executive market. In the early 1980s, Mercedes-Benz saw BMW infiltrating their customer base, so responded with the 190, predecessor to the C-Class that sat beneath the E-Class and S-Class, again the latter of which the XJ had to compete with. Now, Jaguar had always prided themselves on brilliant value for money, meaning that in most cases an XJ was infinitely more affordable than a 7 Series or S-Class. Yet even if we downsize this to a 5 Series or E-Class, Jaguar were missing out on vast swathes of the market. As a part of BL, they had the likes of the Rover SD1 and Triumph Dolomite to try and fill that gap. Yet, as an independent, Jaguar were not only missing out on sales, but also brand loyalty. Something the most basic of BMWs and Mercedes went a long way in establishing. To meet the demands of the late 90s, therefore, Jaguar had to produce their first all-new mid-size saloon car in over 40 years. And that is why the S-Type was so important. The preceding line of compact Jaguars began in 1955, the 2.4 and 3.4 litre saloons becoming their first cars to feature monocoque construction, with a tremendously capable platform, brilliant 6-cylinder engine, and a totally modern, swooshing profile, making them overnight classics. 4 years later, Jaguar addressed many of the car's faults in launching the 2.4 and 3.4 Mark II, plus eventually an enlarged 3.8 litre variant. The march of progress, however, carried on, and both Jaguar's new sports car and big saloon, the E-Type and Mark X, featured a new and utterly world-class independent rear suspension. So good was this system that it remained unmatched for 20 years, but they wasted no time in fitting it to the Mark II, augmenting the existing car in launching the more expensive S-Type in 1963. The problem, however, is that this new car had the same body shell as the Mark II, and as it was considerably heavier, it was slower and thirstier than its cheaper counterpart. Jaguar alleviated the former problem by adding a 4.2 litre engine, but its limited styling updates were also poorly received, meaning the whole exercise proved to be something of a waste of time. Simultaneously, the big Mark X was very poorly judged. At the time, it was the widest car ever sold in Britain, its aim being the conquering of America, but after taxes it was ill-equipped and too expensive to compete, while back in Europe it drank fuel and didn't really fit on our roads. This is when Jaguar began to deteriorate, and they fiddled about with the range, the Mark II becoming the Jaguar 240 and 340, while the S-Type was totally facelifted to bring it closer to the Mark X, this car becoming the Jaguar 420, while the big one became the Jaguar 420G. This is how things would remain until the XJ cleared everything else away in 1968. But the point of discussing all this was both to bring us the origin of the S-Type name and to explain why, having started brilliantly, the compact Jaguar was killed off all those years ago. But as the XJ40 had looked so similar to the original XJ, and the X300 and 308 continued that form, the new compact Jag was also expected to be an exercise in retro styling. By the late 90s, however, this wasn't at all unusual. Volkswagen launched the new Beetle in the same year as the S-Type, and launched beside the Jag at 1998's Birmingham Motor Show was the new Rover 75. A few years later, Rover and BMW would do it again with the R50 Mini, followed 6 years later by the recently departed Fiat 500. The difference was purely the fact that Jaguar were now expected to do such a thing. Yet rather than downsizing the XJ, they went and revived the ovular grille and swooping profile of the Mark I, Mark II and original S-Type. For an era in which their image was growing older and more conservative, what Jaguar had therefore done was build yet another car that was stylistically beholden to their heyday. But in the case of the S-Type, they took things a step further, not only emulating a car that was even older, but also naming it after one that was scuppered by its controversial styling. I promise we are getting to the performance aspect of this S-Type R, But one of this car's features people feel most strongly about is the styling, so it's absolutely central to its fortunes. Back in the 80s, the XJ40 ushered in the age of the boxy Jaguar. While these cars were still superbly elegant, they reflected their era with the sheerness of their grille and big rectangular headlamps. When replaced by the X300 in 1994, Jaguar could return to tracks well trodden, enjoying the 90s taste for curvier cars, bringing back the beautiful haunches that led out from the headlamps. This era of XJ was also a very low car, and that allowed them to aggressively scallop the side profile with that cigar silhouette of the old Mark X and original XJ. In designing the S-Type, therefore, Jaguar's lead designer, Jeff Lawson, knew that he could go all in on those 50s and 60s curves without the new car appearing out of step with its contemporaries. And that's without mentioning the retro trend we've already discussed. A delicately contoured bonnet and 4 distinct headlamps were therefore a necessity. But one thing I really do like about the S-Type is that it was clearly a Jaguar without merely downsizing the XJ. The S-Type is distinct, and I don't think there is a single straight line on this car. From the rear quarter, I think it's masterly. Though harking back to the C-shaped side windows of the 50s, the rear end of the Classic doesn't translate to the aerodynamic or practicality needs of the late 90s, and so this all feels so very fresh. There's certainly an XJ feel to the angles present in the rear lamps, but again, it's unique. The ovals within ovals thing is brilliant, even better when fitted with an oversized number plate. Curiously, however, being an R, this car is devoid of any chrome, but I think that works well. Certainly a standard S-Type is conservative with its chrome, allowing it to age better than many of us would have expected. But from this end of the car, you'd never think that this design was heading towards 30 years of age. The side profile is maybe a little slab-like, but it's strong at least. The real problem being at the front. I'm sorry, but the big ovular grille and the spacing of everything just doesn't work for me. It's gawping. In fact, it appears to me as if someone stuck a leaf blower in front of the face of a cartoon character, all the skin being ripped off their skull. It's seriously ugly in a way I don't think the X-Type, with its XJ-style grille, is. This is coming from a man who believes the Rover 75 is one of the prettiest saloon cars the world has ever seen. So it's not the fact it's retro-styled, but instead the fact that they didn't recognise that the Mark I, Mark II and original S-Type just do not translate into a modern car. But if the S-Type existed to challenge the BMW 5 Series and Mercedes E-Class, then it had to embrace everything the modern mid-size market stood for, including performance. Now, Jaguar have no shortage of performance pedigree. Earlier in the decade, the XJ220 was the fastest car in the world for all of about 30 seconds. In 1975, the XJS was the fastest car in the world with an automatic transmission. 3 years earlier, the XJ12 was the only saloon in the world with a 12-cylinder engine. A decade earlier, the Mark II was the fastest saloon car in the world, while the E-Type was, again, the fastest car in the world, full stop. In fact, 13 years before this, the XK120 was itself the fastest car in the world, and throughout the 1950s, Jaguar just kept winning the 24 Hours of Le Mans. A sporting S-Type would therefore certainly not be unusual, aiming directly for the market occupied by the BMW M5 and more recently the E-Class AMG. Indeed, in lieu of a smaller model, Jaguar debuted the XJR in 1994, complete with a 4-litre supercharged straight six. Yet in typical Jaguar fashion, it displayed this sporting intent in a very restrained manner. So conversely to its unique face, what the S-Type R gets right is exactly what the XJR plus BMW's M division had always gotten right in terms of restraint. You and I are not the greatest example of this, as we're all total nerds, so we'd sniff out an R-badge Jag from a mile off. But as far as the average 40-mile-an-hour everywhere motorist goes, there is nothing about this car that screams supercharged V8 fire breather. I mean, the R-badge is maybe a little obtuse, and its placement in 3 locations is over the top, but taken generally, this car still appears to be a classy, large family saloon. The wheels are more aggressive, the aforementioned chrome is gone and the grille is mesh, but that's just enough to elevate without alienating. The obsession I have with restraint and elegance is something that modern manufacturers have flat out abandoned. I mean, look at the utter state of the current M3 and M5. But back in this era, just look at a W211 Mercedes E55 AMG. Sure, it is lower, has wider wheels, and more aggressive bumpers than a standard 211, but the elegance of the basic car isn't abandoned for the sake of aggression. And then there's the sheer majesty of the E39 BMW M5. These cars are super saloons for people comfortable in their own skin, rather than those desperately chasing attention. Now, I'll be honest and admit that the W211 and E39 don't really overlap in terms of production. The Mercedes is the more modern of the two, but between them we see the full range of competition that our Jaguar faced. Under the bonnet of this is a version of the same AJ V8 as the S-Type had always used, only this time it's hand-built, displaces 4.2 litres and has an Eaton M112 supercharger, allowing it to produce 400 brake horsepower. And that's absolutely in line with an E39 M5. It is, however, about 70 brake horsepower down on a Mercedes E55 AMG. And by the time the S-Type R was really on stream and getting into the hands of customers, BMW were readying for the launch of the E60 M5, with its mad, enormously high revving, if slightly fragile, 5-litre V10. An engine which made 500 brake horsepower, so you would expect in this context for the S-Type to feel really quite outclassed. That couldn't be further from the truth, however, because this car also produces 400 pounds-feet of torque. Now, an E55 AMG makes quite a serious amount more than that. That era of Mercedes V8 was famous for just how torquey it was, but an E-Class was quite a bit more expensive. That's part of why BMW sold far more M5s than Mercedes sold E55 AMGs. And so the 400 pound-feet of this is, well, it eviscerates the 370 pounds-feet of an E39 M5. And it's even more than that big V10. So while those other engines can feel a little bit toppy, the Jaguar suits its 6-speed ZF automatic transmission, which of course was mandatory, and it has this big kind of hunk of mid-range acceleration. In fact, this was only the second car to get the 6-speed version of ZF's automatic gearbox after the BMW 7 Series, the E65, in 2001. So for its era, this was absolutely on the money in terms of transmission. It just goes about things a little bit differently to an E39 M5, which you might say, yeah, I want the manual transmission. But at the end of the day, an E60 M5, at least in Europe, and a Mercedes AMG were both found only with automatic gearboxes. This AJ V8 must be one of the greatest engines that Great Britain has ever produced, because it was first launched in 1996 under the bonnet of the new Jag XK8. But although it was fundamentally redesigned for direct fuel injection, it still survives in a form to this day as the V8 in the new Defender. It is now being finally totally replaced, but this engine has lived for a heck of a long time, and all of the performance Jags, at least the V8 ones, certainly from the late 90s all the way through to when they stopped making them only a few years ago, every single performance hot Jag used a version of this engine. In fact, there goes an F-Type, which if it's a V8 will also have this AJ V8. But my first impression of it when attached to this gearbox is just how smooth it is. This is from an era where super saloons did not feel as though they had to shout about their performance ambitions. None of them really did. And while if you get this going, it does make that brilliant V8 noise with a load of supercharger whine, when you're pootling around town at very normal speeds, you need minimal throttle inputs and it just floats about almost completely silently. And then you put your thumb down, and once the gearbox decides it wants to shift down, you just get this big old thump of power, which is so very Jaguar-like. It's very graceful in that aspect, in that it doesn't need the crudity of a manual gearbox in order to deliver the power. And I say wait for the gearbox, and yes, you do have to wait just a fraction of a second. It's not immediate, but it's not slow by any means either, and I'd absolutely live with the compromise, have one of these with its automatic gearbox and not complain at all. And even if it does take a fraction of a second to really get going, the throttle response, even with a classic torque converter automatic transmission, the throttle response is really quite amazing, far better than the throttle response of any BMW that I've driven of this kind of era. And so what that means is that just millimeters beneath your right foot, you have this absolute bark. And while some people are not huge fans of supercharger whine, I absolutely am. And I think people overdo it a little bit because it's not as pronounced as a lot of people say it is. This feels much more of an 8-cylinder engine than it does a supercharged engine, at least first and foremost, if you catch my drift here. I'd love a little bit of old advertising, and I also love buying into the cliches that manufacturers make for themselves. So in the 50s and 60s, in the era of the original S-Type, Jaguar was all grace, space, and pace. They were the three words that they always used to describe themselves and what they did. And from right here behind this steering wheel, the grace and the pace are absolutely here, and they are so intertwined. They are inseparable, the grace and the pace, because never in this car do you feel as though it wants you to hunt for mad illegal speeds. Instead, it enjoys the fact that you are taking it easy, that you're enjoying the countryside and you're enjoying the ambience of this interior. And we have now just floated up to our nice cruising speed. I even have the window ever so slightly open and it's still so wonderfully quiet. I totally understand that, I am probably not the target customer in that regard for, in terms of an AMG Mercedes, something that's all fire, that's all action all of the time. This isn't that, but I just look at this and think, it's so cozy, and I really enjoy that character. When discussing image, however, I want to get something clear that, judging by my viewer demographics, you'll all understand. You see, the two age groups that primarily watch twin cam are the under 35s and the over 65s. And if you know anything about the automotive community, that won't surprise you at all. The older of you are the ones who tend to run the car clubs and gained that interest in an era where the car represented personal freedom and individuality. And for the folks of my age, car enthusiasm is more mainstream than ever. There are far more shows than ever, and the internet has allowed this huge expansion in automotive culture. But more than liking cars, our two age groups have something else in common. We all love Jaguars. Of course, the older amongst you remember Jaguar's glory days of building the fastest cars in the world and winning Le Mans time and again. Then they decided to build the world's only 12-cylinder saloon car, because why not? But when I was growing up, and at school we'd talk about cars, it was the Ian Callum era of the XFR and F-Type that got our pulses racing. Those two were considered far cooler than anything from BMW or Mercedes-Benz, partly because they had V8s and looked fantastic, but also thanks to Top Gear. The problem is that older people tend to keep hold of their cars, and people my age can't buy Jaguars. Regardless of the fact that their range was left to age, and they've now all been killed off, Jaguar's financial position meant they couldn't offer the lease deals that the Germans could. That's presuming young people can afford anything in the post-crash economy. Those who could, however, saw a Mercedes A-Class or a BMW 1 Series and jumped into brand loyalty over there instead. Jaguar's newfound image of cool did not translate at all into actual bums on seats. The 35s to 65s, however, are the ones that mattered to Jaguar, and they all had an image of British Leyland failure, confused styling that was stuck in the 60s, and a generally fuddy-duddy image. Jaguar's recent upheaval isn't surprising at all if you remember that no one has actually bought one for decades now. And the reason I felt this ramble was necessary is because chances are you, watching this now, quite like Jags. We've rather gotten ahead of ourselves, however, because before meeting the market reception to our thunderous S-Type, we have the suspension to deal with. Now, a lot of people deride the S-Type and its little brother, the X-Type, for using platforms derived from Ford. And if you're some kind of purist who thinks everything should be dictated by Jaguar because it's a Jaguar, well, we'd never have had the S-Type. Jaguar didn't have much money, and designing cars is a jolly expensive business, so we shouldn't be surprised that this was the solution. In the event, the S-Type shares its platform with the Lincoln LS and the ill-fated Ford Thunderbird. But we didn't see either of those cars in Europe, so the S-Type might as well be unique. Indeed, this same platform is what was eventually found under the first generation XF, and that is proof of its competence. And although it was originally dictated by Ford, much of its componentry and all of its tuning was engineered by Jaguar. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is a Jaguar. There are no, caveats to that. It's rear-wheel drive and it has a thoroughly sophisticated suspension setup. So, beneath a BMW of this era was, a all-new independent rear suspension that was very, very competent, but at the front, it had simple McPherson struts. And that's absolutely fine. It even gives a sense of delicacy to the car. But this Jaguar has double wishbones, just about the best suspension setup you could imagine. And at the back, at least for a road car, and at the back we have another set of McPherson struts. And that means that geometry-wise, we're already pretty much perfect here. What we cannot get away from, however, is this car's weight. 1,800 kilograms is a lot regardless of how heavy modern big saloon cars are. And, at the end of the day, you cannot get away from that. The engine and the brakes are so good that you don't really notice it. But any tiny turn of the steering wheel, and you can tell that there is 1,800 kilograms worth of car there. It's not disconcerting in any manner, and certainly it is a very competent car. It has a brilliant turning to it, and so much confidence is inspired from that. And then you step on the brakes like I am now, and again, it just bites on them so nicely. I just wish, I do have it in fully automatic, by the way. You can, of course, shift it over into the J-gate and shift it manually, but I don't find that it's much more responsive. Sure, you can choose the gears yourself, but I mean, come on. That's the one thing I do wish I had when just pushing it a little bit more is that extra control over the revs that the engine is producing at any given speed. Now the Jag has that double wishbone front suspension and it has rack and pinion steering, and you can feel that in the way it feels dynamically. But the steering is far too light. It's not communicative in any kind of manner, and it appears as though the suspension is set up primarily for understeer. So that competence I spoke of a minute ago is absolutely brilliant, and you have so much confidence from it in spite of not having much feel in the steering, a lot of lightness in the steering, which, you know, it feels very Jaguar in that way. Certainly classic XJs had enormously light steering that this is heavier than, but still it's too light. But it means that you're going, and you've got all this confidence in it, and it feels brilliant. And then suddenly it understeers. And then all of a sudden it doesn't feel all that competent, and you get absolutely no indication that it's about to go from the steering. It just kind of goes. I wouldn't use the word snapped, because this is understeer we're talking about, and it's not exactly unpredictable. Oh, thank you. But at the end of the day, in this car, it does not feel as though it's the kind of car that would enjoy drama. I mean, it doesn't even have a limited slip differential, so it's not the easiest car to just hold sideways in mad, you know, Chris Harris or Jeremy Clarkson style drifts all day. Instead, it's absolutely clear to me that this car is set up for comfort primarily, and I'm very happy with that because it has the competence to go with it. It's just a bit of a shame that suddenly it has that 5% right at the end where it doesn't feel all that controlled. And in being understeery, it's not even the fun sense of out of control, it's just the scary, that tree's getting closer kind of out of control. I'm seeing it then as kind of the polar opposite of an E55 AMG, which I'm led to believe is 95% madness and only 5% normality just when you drive it really gently. This is totally the other way around, and it's absolutely kind of what I want out of a car. I feel very comfortable in this. I know some people like that kind of drama, that oversteery madness, but I do not. And therefore I am very, very happy in this Jaguar, just with that sense of competence, that unerring competence that comes from having a car that feels quite well sprung and very well damped, in fact. This car is a comfortable car, but you can feel that it does ultimately have some performance ambitions. It doesn't totally get rid of any feeling of the road beneath you. It's always, you're made aware of what's happening beneath you without it ever encumbering your progress. But as I alluded to earlier, this and its peers were not racing cars. They are big family saloons with ballistic engines in them, so rather than egging you on to drive at its limits, the S-Type encourages you to choose a speed you're comfortable with, then it rows through the gears at its own leisure, and the brilliant to a point damping ensures your safety. It's very point and shoot, with no unnecessary drama 95% of the time, just that nice thump of supercharger whine when you put your foot down. All indications suggest that the E55 is mad virtually all the time, while an E39 steering, being recirculating ball, surely can't be any better. The struts may make the front feel more delicate, but it'll be the manual transmission that gives you a sense of involvement. The Germans, therefore, suggest to me that they'll want you to push on, but the Jag feels how I would want a super saloon to feel. Just supreme in its composure, quiet, comfortable, with power always in reserve for your nice continental trips. But that brings me to the conclusion that the S-Type R is a thoroughly good car, one that ultimately comes down to how you prefer to drive. It does, however, have a couple of faults that scuppered its progress. The first is obvious, and that's the styling. It would be fair to say that this shape doesn't appear to be 27 years old, but you cannot get past that controversial face. Yet on the other side of that coin, BMW's E39 is now 30 years of age, and I reckon they could still be building that car today. What I'm saying is that I'm an apologist for the Jag in spite of its flaws here, But the simple fact is that it sat up against possibly the most timeless saloon car ever built. The second problem is the image that Jaguar by this point had, and we discussed it earlier on, the pipe and slippers thing. All you need to know is that the subsequent XF abandoned the retro, Ian Callum dragging the marque into the current century, leading to that revival in Jaguars actually being quite cool. The S-Type sits in an era where Jags had to be apologised for, and that's reflected in terms of production and value. Of the three cars we've been name-checking, the M5 stormed away from the rest. Compared to the Mercedes and the lesser-seen Jag, M5s were common across the world, yet that is not reflected in their current values. An S-Type R is around a third the price of a nice E39 M5, making this an absolute bargain. Yet we also have to realise that this is a very gentle car, designed for heated seats and air conditioning and long cross-continental voyages that just so happens to have a biblical engine. And on that nuanced conclusion, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you would like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.